what this risk assessment is saying is, there are these, potential, according to the EPA at this time, there's different ways that this could potentially expose certain people. And again, it's not nationally representative. It's not about the average person or total people. It's about certain very specific hypothetical scenarios. And so they've said, well, there are these, hypothetical scenarios where there could be an issue.
Hello, everyone. I am Alex Cosson. I am Associate Editor at Wastewater Digest. I am here with Kyle Thompson, who is National PFAS Lead for Corolla. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We should probably take a step back here and just kind of cover like the overall findings of the risk assessment. Can you just kind of describe like what you found in the EPA's initial assessment and just your takeaways from it?
Yeah, so what they did in this risk assessment, so they looked at potential health risks from PFOA and PFOS that were in sludge, and when the sludge is treated so that it's ready for land application, it becomes called biosolids when it's been prepared for the land application. And so they took a scenario of, what if there was, 1 part per billion of PFOA or PFOS and these biosolids, and they looked at land application and a couple different agricultural scenarios, different types of farms within that, and they looked at surface disposal. I think it's pretty important to point out that they did not look at, they looked at incineration, but they didn't calculate any risks. They said the data is not there yet for them to calculate any risks for incineration. And then they did not look at what if the biosolids are put into landfills. They said that that's regulated under RCRA, not the Clean Water Act, and so that it was out of scope for the risk assessment at this time. So of the different main choices of what can be done with biosolids, because there's always going to be biosolids coming from wastewater treatment, so we need to do something with it. But they really only looked at 2 out of the 4 or 5 main options, right? So within those scenarios, it calculated different exposure pathways. So I believe there's 18 exposure pathways, ways that these chemicals, if they're in biosolids, they could go from the biosolids to a plant that people eat directly, biosolids to a cow, people eat the cow, biosolids to the soil, to the plant, to the cow, to the milk, to the person, right? So they go through all these different pathways. And so from that starting concentration, they look at how much of that PFAS might wind up going to a person, and then comparing that to these safe levels. So there's what's called a reference dose, which is the level. Not that if you're above that, you'll have a health effect, but that if you're below that, then there's a absolutely negligible chance of any health effect, right? And then also they looked at the cancer, what they call the cancer slope factor, and from that cancer slope factor calculate a 1 in a million odds of cancer over a person's lifetime. And so they compared, all right, so PFAS from the 1 part per billion in biosolids goes through all these pathways, gets to a person, and then comparing that to the safe levels for cancer and for non-cancer health effects.
Gotcha.
But again, they didn't look at all of the things that might be done with biosolids, and they also didn't look at any of the benefits of biosolids, because there's health benefits to biosolids too, right? Because just as we need to do something with biosolids, we also need to fertilize our farms, right? And so if you don't use biosolids to fertilize the farms where that's currently done, presumably you would use synthetic fertilizer as well. But it's very environmentally intensive to create, a lot of the energy is used to create synthetic fertilizers. And also once the fertilizer is on the farm, the nitrate from that fertilizer can wash off into groundwater and the surface water, and that's also toxic, right? There's a drinking water limit on nitrate in drinking water. So if you're land applying biosolids, for the same amount of nitrogen, you actually get less nitrate going to the river. So there's health benefits to land applying biosolids too, but that wasn't included in this draft risk assessment for now.
Right. So this risk risk assessment basically just covered like land application and land use, right? There wasn't really anything outside of
Yeah,
that.
right.
Gotcha. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. How can utilities plan for this regulation?
And so there's a couple things that can be done for planning. So one thing that we often recommend is, to keep options open, frankly, because what this risk assessment is saying is, there are these potential, according to the EPA at this time, there's different ways that this could potentially expose certain people. And again, it's not nationally representative. It's not about the average person or total people. It's about certain very specific hypothetical scenarios. And so they've said, well, there are these hypothetical scenarios where there could be an issue. But then on the other hand, again, it's just draft. It hasn't gone through the public comment. There hasn't been this risk management step where we consider, well, what about the other scenarios? What about the benefits? So there may or may not be federal rule on PFAS and biosolids someday, and it may wind up at different levels. So it could be that it ends up at a level that would impact a lot of utilities, or perhaps in response to the public comment, other considerations, maybe not, or even if it does happen, it might happen so far into the future that it's less of an issue. Because something really good that we've been seeing is studies are showing that over time, the PFAS that's detected in biosolids and wastewater is less, right? So as we get further and further from when these chemicals were taken out of U.S. manufacturing, it's in less and less of the household products and less degrees. So one plausible scenario here is that we get this rule eventually, but by the time that it happens, it's become less of a widespread problem. So one thing we say is, keep your options open, plan long term, go through different what if scenarios of as if there is a limit at an impactful level. What might you do in response to that when it happens? Another thing that can be done for planning is to go ahead and sample biosolids for these chemicals. So there's a rule that's in progress right now that at least for the largest 200, 300 largest facilities or so will require the biosolids sampling for PFAS, right? So if you go ahead and that could be late next year, or sorry, it's 2025 now, late 2025, early 2026, right?
Mhm.
So if you're gonna need to do it pretty soon anyway, if you go ahead and do it a little sooner than you're required, that will then give you a head start for if you do need to do source control, because that's another scenario that might come at the federal level. Because what we've seen a lot at the state level, states like Michigan, is where they intentionally set the level for PFAS and biosolids at a level that could be achieved through source control, or might just require the process of source control rather than requiring, meet this number, right? So once you've sampled biosolids for PFAS, you can compare that to averages and statistical ranges and say, oh, is this just the domestic baseload, just the levels of PFAS that we see from PFAS in household products winding up in the wastewater, or is it high enough that it indicates some sort of source, right? Because these chemicals, they've been PFOA and PFOS, they've been phased out of U.S. manufacturing, but we still see outliers in the data, and so that could be, from landfill, leachate. It could be we've seen cases where from an Air Force base or an airport, the groundwater gets contaminated from a place where these chemicals were used, and then it can, through the inflow and infiltration, can get into certain of the sewer lines, right? So you can have a point source in that way, even if nobody's still actively using the chemical in your area in an intentional way, right? But so once you go and find it out, you can start taking corrective action, and then that might then help you comply with the future rule, whether that future rule is a numerical limit or is requiring to go through that kind of source control process.
Mhm. So what kind of like treatment technologies are currently offered, to treat PFAS out of biosolids? Like what's our best option?
So right now, the most mature option available is incineration. So
Mhm.
PFAS, they're very resistant to heat, and that's why they were used for firefighting foam for jet fuel, but they're not heat invincible, right? So you get up to 1,000 degrees Celsius is what people usually cite as the heat where you can pretty consistently and quickly get breakdown of the PFAS. So kind of a caveat to that, a lot of the incinerators that are currently used for biosolids aren't at that temperature, right? So it might take some modification of incinerators or building new incinerators, which is a very lengthy process, including all the permitting that goes into something like that. But so incineration is capable of destroying PFAS and biosolids. Then, kind of next in line, there's a very small number of installations, but there's these processes, pyrolysis and gasification, and both of those, they're also heat-based processes like incineration, but it's applying heat in an oxygen-limited environment with the goal of making either a biochar or a gas that can then be used as a product. Whether biochar can, some people question whether biosolids-based biochar is land applicable, but there's
Mhm.
other uses that could be done with that, or a gas that can be used as a heat source. And but so far there's really only a very small number of installations of that at a large scale. So that's kind of I hesitate to quite call that a mature or scalable technology quite yet. And
Mhm.
then kind of next in line, there's a large pilot right now going on in Florida for a technology called supercritical water oxidation, or SQUO. And again, it's this kind of heat theme, right? But now it's heat and pressure, and it changes the water into a state called supercritical, and that changes a lot of the chemistry in the water, and then makes it so that now these PFAS are able to break down. So that's maybe next in line of the processes that are emerging for this, but it's still pilot scale. It's hard to say how long it might be until that's established as a full scale, widespread, scalable technology, right? So if there were, and we've seen this from the state of Maine, for example, where they did a land application ban. There's a county in Arizona where they did a temporary ban, and it was frankly kind of a mess trying to find
Mhm.
alternative places to send these biosolids. And so if there were a very abrupt regulation, that would be very difficult to find any destination with the capacity to handle that influx of biosolids.
Gotcha. So my last question here is, what's the best way to communicate regulations with utilities and their customers?
Right. So again, just want to clarify that this is not a regulation. This is just
Mhm.
a early step in the regulatory process. But I think anytime you're communicating with the public about PFAS, whether that's in response to a government announcement, or if this is getting attention for another reason, so I think it's best to start from a place of caring. So there's this acronym CAP: caring, action, and perspective. And so you want to start with caring. You want to start from a place of empathy, from communicating that you understand people's concerns, because there's a lot of people very concerned about this. That there is a very large number of studies on the toxicity of PFOA and PFOS. There's been a lot of media attention to these chemicals, even Hollywood movies, and a lot of these health effects that have been linked. Some of them are specific to mothers or to children, which is I think very emotionally um, very emotionally evocative, right? It's very emotionally charging. So you really want to say we understand your concerns, and you don't want to come off like you're downplaying the issue, because that's not going to put people in a place where they want to then listen to what you have to say, right? And so secondly, action, right? So you want to say, this is what we are doing about this, right? Show that well, maybe the issue is not solved, we are doing our best, we care, we understand, and we're doing our best, we're doing something to be proactive about this issue. And then lastly, perspective, right? So once you've established the empathy and established that trust, then you can start contextualizing this issue, right? So again, this draft risk assessment, it looked at just the downsides of just certain options, right? But when you start, explaining more perspective, you start learning more about this issue, because this is not, just a biosolids issue, right? The
Mhm.
PFOA and PFOS, they were made in large quantities over many decades, with essentially no regulation on them at the time, right? And so they dispersed throughout the whole global environment. They've been detected in rain and snow on every continent, on both poles, on the top of Mount Everest. And because of that, they've also been detected in the soil all over the world. Because if it's in the rain, it'll get into the soil, right? So there was a recent study, they did soil sampling all over the New England region, and they found average PFOS in soil across the whole New England region at over 1 part per billion on average. So this, if this hypothetical scenario that the EPA looked at, looking at 1 part per billion PFOS, if you were to add that to the soil, on average, most locations, that could actually be diluting the PFAS that's already there, right? So that's just one example of the many, the many
Mhm.
things you could point out about the facts about this broader PFAS issue that say, okay, so maybe this isn't, you know, maybe putting a strict limit, doing something besides land application with biosolids. Maybe that's not the best overall solution for protecting the public health.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Kyle. Is there anything else that you want to add that you think I may have missed?
No, I think that's pretty good.
Okay.